Hello and welcome to another Mr. Lang's Vlogs. Now today we're going to be discussing immigration and the Gilded Age. Okay, so let's get started. Now there's a difference between the old immigrants and the new immigrants. The old immigrants who we discussed in US 1 were, again, primarily Protestants from Northwest Europe. You're going to have a lot of the Irish and a lot of the Germans coming over. Well, now it's going to be a lot more. We're going to have a lot more immigrants, but they're going to be from Southern or Eastern Europe as well. That's going to include everything from the Czechs to the Greeks to the Hungarians to the Italians to the Polish to the Russians to the Slavic to the Chinese and the Japanese as well. And again, they're going to come through and have many different challenges when they come over. And when they do, one of them is going to be to learn the language and, of course, to get through Ellis Island. Ellis Island is located in New York. It was the arrival point for many European immigrants, and they had to pass inspection at the immigration stations. Processing took hours, and the sick were sent home instantly. Immigrants also had to show they were not criminals and had some sort of money. Usually it was around $25, and were able to work. Now, from 1892 to 1924, 17 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island's facilities. You can go there today. It's still up and running as a museum, and you can even check your ancestry. And a lot of times there are a lot of little mess ups on names and so on that have carried on. And if you ever looked into your ancestry, you would see as well that maybe your ancestors did come from Ellis Island. It could be. Many millions of Americans can trace their heritage back through Ellis Island. Now, this is what it looked like in 1905. Again, Ellis Island looks very similar to what it does today. There was also a different type of Ellis Island entry point into the U.S. It was called Angel Island in San Francisco. And this is where Asians, primarily Chinese, arrived, and they arrived on the West Coast. They gained admission at Angel Island in the San Francisco Bay. And processing was much, much harsher than in Ellis Island, as immigrants withstood tough questioning and long detentions and filthy conditions. Want to see some of these conditions? Boom. Not very good. And they were detained for quite a while, and didn't have adequate food as well sometimes. Now, frictions start to develop because while some immigrants try to assimilate into American culture, again, basically come into American culture and become one with it, others kept to themselves and created ethnic communities. And some were committed to their own culture, but they also tried hard to become Americans. Many came to think of themselves as, for example, Italian Americans versus just Americans or Italian. And some native-born Americans, even called nativists, disliked immigrants. They did not like immigrants. They believed that they will take their jobs because they will work for cheaper, as well as their unfamiliar customs and languages starts to form some friction. Now, a lot of times what they'll do is to keep their culture alive, they would actually have little ethnic communities in big cities, things like Chinatown, things like Little Italy in New York. And this is how the ethnicities could go and still have those customs with their culture, but at the same time still be in America. Now, we have immigration restrictions, because as immigration increased, so did anti-immigration feelings among the nativists. And in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which limited Chinese immigration until 1943. And immigrants equaled cheap labor. Immigrants put a lot of average Americans out of work, because they were willing to do the same work cheaper and for longer hours. So this leads to those nativists that we were talking about before reacting. And they react with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, that law also denied U.S. citizenship to people born in China. It also prohibited Chinese immigrants to become laborers. As you can see from the Chinese wall around the United States of America political cartoon. Now, the Europeans between 1870 and 1920 were about 20 million that came in. And before 1890, most were from Western and Northern Europe. But after, most came from Southern and Eastern Europe. But they were all looking for opportunity. And again, the Chinese, again, got hit with that anti-Chinese Immigration Act. And a lot of them were attracted by the gold rush in 1851 when they came over, even though the gold rush was 1849. But they kind of came a little too late. Okay, again, the Japanese came over, West Indies and Mexico, again, skimming through due to lack of time. But nevertheless, a lot of them came via boat, a lot of these immigrants. And the trip was arduous and many died along the way. And the destination was either or Ellis Island or Angel Island. Now, we also have new cities that come up during this time. Skyscrapers build those cities up. Mass transit, kind of like the T we have here in Boston, built cities outward as well. And people live in these tenements, these poorly built apartment buildings. And the cities were slums. They were huge problems. They were dirty. These urban problems were including housing, were overcrowded and very unsanitary. Sanitation overall. Garbage was often not collected, and it polluted the air. We also had transportation. Cities struggled to provide adequate transportation. We had water. Without safe drinking water, cholera and typhoid fever were very common. Crime, that was huge. Fire, because of the limited water supply. And lots of wooden structures very close together. And the use of candles instead of electricity. Boom, you have the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871, and of course the San Francisco Fire of 1906. Two major fires come out of this. Now we have reformers that help mobilize, one of them being Jane Addams in the Hull House. We have Jane Addams that actually creates the Hull House, where poor could be educated as well as other services given to them for free, out of the goodness of her heart. We also have Jacob Riis, reformer, through his pictures, which we did that activity in class, that he hoped for change. He influenced many. He showed the rich how the poor lived. And the social gospel movement overall preached salvation through service to the poor. And some reformers also created settlement houses. These are community service centers, basically, that provided a place to stay, classes, healthcare, and other social services, much like Jane Addams did. And the cities were building up. But the rich, however, showed off their conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption is when the rich show off their wealth, where literally they buy random stuff just to look rich, just to show off that they're rich. And some of the people that are incredibly rich during this time are the criminals during the Gilded Age. Now, the Gilded Age is very much something where politics, the political machine, Boss Tweed, were running these cities. Because as cities grew in the late 19th century, so did these political machines. Now, a political machine isn't actually a machine, but political machine controls the activities of a political party in the city. Ward bosses, precinct captains, and the city boss worked together to ensure the candidate was elected. And their candidate, of course, in this case, was Boss Tweed, William Marcy Tweed. So the boss, typically the mayor, controlled job licenses, business licenses, and influenced the courts. And they even had precinct captains working underneath them. They were often first and second generation immigrants. Now, what these political bosses do are very corrupt. They literally will use fake names and vote multiple times to ensure victory. The whole saying of vote early and often came from this. That's election fraud. Now, we also have grafts, also known as bribes. They were common among political bosses as well. And a lot of these things also lead to kickbacks, where if you get to build something here, the boss would get a kickback. And the fact that the police force were hired as the boss prevented close scrutiny. Again, they were hired basically as security. And we have the hugest scandal of all time called the Tweed Ring Scandal, where William Marcy Tweed, known as Boss Tweed, became the head of Tammany Hall, New York City's most powerful democratic political machine. And between 1869 to 1871, Tweed led the Tweed Ring, a group of corrupt politicians defrauding the city. And Tweed was indicted on 120 counts of fraud and extortion. And he was sentenced to 12 years in jail, but he was only released after one. He was arrested again, but then he eventually escaped to Spain. Alright, so important terms you do need to know. Patronage, also known as the spoils system. You may remember this from Andrew Jackson, but basically gives the government jobs to supporters of a political party, not really to qualified people. You have, during this time, people called stalwarts, which are Republican politicians who support the patronage system, half-breeds, that are Republicans who strongly support the civil service reforms, which we're going to be talking about, and the mugwumps, which are great names overall, right? Which are Democratic reformers who were opposed to the patronage system being the spoils system. They called for a merit system, where jobs went to the most qualified people. Okay? And this is how you define the voting blocks. Again, Democratic versus Republican. Now, the 1880 presidential election was between the half-breeds and the stalwarts. Again, James A. Garfield is going to be going for president with his VP Chester Arthur. Now, they come to a compromise because James Garfield becomes president in 1880, and his vice president, Chester Arthur, is a stalwart. Now, Garfield is a half-breed, and he pushes for reform. And you can see this is a more popular Garfield. However, 1881, Garfield was assassinated, and he's assassinated by Charles Guiteau, who says, "I am a stalwart, and now Arthur is president now." Remember, Arthur was a stalwart, Garfield was a half-breed, so he wanted a stalwart to be president. However, Arthur changes his mind. After Garfield's death, he becomes a half-breed and pushes for the reforms that Garfield did. And one thing he put in place was the civil service exam. Nationally, some politicians push for reform in the hiring system. Again, what ends up happening is the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883 authorized a bipartisan commission to make appointments for federal jobs based on performance. Basically, they had to take a test. They had to make sure they were qualified for this job. They couldn't just get it because they were somebody's friend. And on top of that, we have a dirty campaign. We're going to be talking about Grover Cleveland soon enough and how the famous song "Ma Ma, Where's My Pie? He's going to the White House, ha ha ha," because there's a lot of campaigning when Arthur goes against Grover Cleveland, and we're going to see what the result of that is. But that's all the time I have for you now. So, again, if you have any questions, feel free to tell me, and I will answer them. Thank you for watching, and have a great rest of your day.